It is an honor to introduce to you this evening William Allen and Danielle Allen. For well over half a century, William B. Allen has been a fixture in American political thought. His academic work has explored the moral and prudential foundations of American constitutional order. His writings probe the deliberative thought of our founders writ large, the words of our founding documents, and the evolution of our national character. Bill is Emeritus Professor of Political Philosophy at Michigan State University, where he also served as Dean of the James Madison College, a liberal arts college within a larger comprehensive university. And throughout his life, Bill has done just great yeoman civic service. He put himself forward as a candidate for the U.S. Senate. He's served as a member of the National Council of the Humanities, as chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and as the executive director of Virginia's State Council of Higher Education. Danielle Allen, Bill's daughter, has established herself as
as accomplishments.
And that is absolutely true, is one of America's preeminent political theorists and public intellectuals. She currently holds the Jane Bryant Conant University Professorship at Harvard University, where she also directs the Edmund and Lily Sofra Center for Ethics. In addition to her notable scholarly contributions on democratic theory, including a very influential reading of the Declaration of Independence, our declaration, and I think many of you have encountered that through your study here at Brigham Young University. Danielle has engaged directly with the most challenging issues of the day as a leader in the nonprofit sector, as a celebrated Washington Post columnist, and recently making a run at being a gubernatorial candidate in Massachusetts. Let's provide a very warm welcome to the Allens.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay. I want to know, how often have the two of you shared a university rostrum together?
Well, we have shared the rostrum, but not in this particular profile.
Uh-huh.
I have been blessed to have Danielle appear in classes or on programs for me on more than one occasion. It was always a great honor to do so. So in that sense, we were on the same rostrum, but we've never been co-presenters.
Never co-presenters.
Yep, this is a special occasion, father-daughter event. So another father-daughter pair here, so that's exciting. But yes, it's a first time. So.
And we are so honored that you'd make that happen for us. We knew we wanted to make this happen, and everything fell together. So thank you very much for making the extra effort. So, Bill, my thunder was stolen when Danielle said that she's really at the top of your CV.
I said that to someone earlier, did I not?
I have children of whom I'm immensely proud, but Danielle is a wunderkind. Right?
You should meet my brother, though. My brother, different league altogether.
Well, okay, so let me just give you a sense of this. So according to my calculation, by age 33, Danielle was Dean of the Division of Humanities at the University of Chicago, having graduated summa cum laude from Princeton in classics, having been a Marshall Scholar at Cambridge or Oxford?
Cambridge, yeah.
King's College, Cambridge, where she got an MPhil and a PhD in classics, and then somehow fit in getting a master's degree and a PhD in government at Harvard. Am I correct? While you were at Chicago, sort of?
Yep, sort of. Yeah,
Okay,
that's about right.
Something like this.
Sort of.
So, okay.
It's a long story.
I'm going to ask Father here, Dad. How do you explain this kind of extraordinary accomplishment? Is it nurture? Is it nature? Or is society to blame?
Well, you're asking a question that I was frequently asked, Paul, when my children were very young.
It's true.
And many of our friends and colleagues would ask, how do you do it? Because their performance at that age was singular. And I always shrug my shoulders and says, I don't do it, they do it.
So it's nature? Is it nature?
You're posing a Manichaean problem here, which it is not to me to resolve.
Okay.
I say, yes, of course, nature provides endowments, but they had themselves to work on their natures. That's why I won't say simply nature. I won't deprive them of credit for what they have accomplished.
Okay.
I'll tell you two stories.
Yeah,
okay,
thank you.
Just to give some context. These are sort of, one's a story, one's just a sort of a comment, but things I often say when people ask me the question of, you must have had amazing parents. I always get that question. You get the exactly. I get the you must have had amazing parents question. And I did have amazing parents for sure, no question about it. And one of the greatest gifts, they gave me many great gifts, but one of them was to see me as who I was, to ask me to find my passions and commitments, to communicate to me that if I worked behind those passions, anything was possible. So not to say, here's what you should be or what you should do, but you show us, Danielle, what your passion is, and we'll show you how to connect that to the work and the effort and the structure to deliver on that. So I think it was those things together. But the story I was going to tell is that I had this piano teacher, Gaddy P. Holmes. She was very short, 4'10". She had to use cushions when she was driving her car to see over the steering wheel. And she was tough. Man, I started my lessons in 3rd grade, and I cried at every single piano lesson because it was so hard, and I felt so demoralized because I was not accomplishing what I expected. And at the end of the year, my father said to me, Danielle, you're really upsetting your piano teacher. Either you have to stop crying or you have to quit piano. But if you're going to quit piano, you have to tell Miss Holmes. So I took piano until I graduated from high school.
From Miss Holmes?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Now, I am curious. So these are great, and I really appreciate you bringing this out. You mention in your writing, Danielle, in more than one occasion, you talk about dinner table conversations. And you actually also talk about dinner table debates. There's Aunt Rosalind who shows up at dinner table debates. I'm just curious, what was the dinner table like, and are there kind of rituals, maxims, traditions within the Allen home as you were growing up?
There was only one ritual we had, and that was systematic reading of the Bible. 2 chapters from the Old Testament, one from the New. Pardon me, one from the Old, 2 from the New. This is the reverse. 2 from the Old, 1 from the New Testament every single night.
She remembers very well, it looks like.
That was the only ritual.
Uh-huh.
The rest was totally spontaneous. I'm sure Danielle's recollection is better than mine about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's true, we did that. We read our way through the Bible twice, so the whole text. I don't remember reading Old and New in the same evening, but anyway. We definitely read all the way through twice over dinner. But then I think what you're also talking about is, my dad, professor, had an incredible community of graduate students. And this community of graduate students were all deeply engaged in questions about the American founding and constitutionalism and what were the prospects for this country in, at the time, the 20th century and the like. And so I was a little kid in the middle of all of that, and I did soak it up. I loved those conversations. And then there were also the conversations where extended family came together, holidays and the like, and that's what you're alluding to, where I always say, people always want to know, how do kids become committed to civic engagement? How do we get that motivation to take responsibility for our civic life? And I think part of the answer is family, and I came from a family with deep traditions of civic engagement. My dad's dad helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in northern Florida, which is exceptionally dangerous work. My great-grandmother and great-grandfather fought for women's right to vote. My great-grandmother was president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 30s. So there was that sort of deep engagement. But in my dad's generation, you covered the waterfront in terms of political positions. So my Aunt Rosalind was like the antithesis of my dad. You can see he's skinny fellow, bald. He was bald when I was young. That's an old feature here. It's been for a long time. My aunt was a big woman, built like a Mack truck, big belly laugh. And he was running for office as a Reagan conservative in Southern California. She was running for office in the Bay Area for Congress as a member of the Peace and Freedom Party. So those were the debates we used to have over the dinner table, right? How to achieve empowerment, completely different visions of what was needed.
Now, you must understand something. Those doubtlessly sounded like debates to the ears of a youth, but for us, they were mere conversations.
So this is modeled in an extraordinary way. Did you, Danielle, were you aware, for example, of your grandfather's engagement with the NAACP in Florida? Was that part of family lore? Was it?
I mean, in some sense, not those specifics, not those organizational specifics, but I certainly knew my grandfather. He was a Baptist preacher in the final sort of phase of his career in southern Georgia. And he was a powerful preacher, powerful in the pulpit, and he was a proud man, always ramrod straight, and communicated a great sense of commitment to his own community, but also clarity about his own purpose and the responsibility he wanted to take for his world.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned purpose, Danielle, because I want to clarify something. I mean, Paul's questions seem to be leading to an inquiry into the degree of intentionality that lay at the bottom of development within our family. And that, from my perspective, would be a mistaken line and approach to take. It wasn't a question of intending to form this or that kind of family or intending to engage in this or that kind of activity. It was nothing other than the expression of acquired and cultivated sense of responsibility and the exploitation of opportunities as they arose. A lot of this was quite spontaneous. Some of it was response to need. My father's founding of the NAACP chapter was response to need at a certain time when I was just a wee lad, only 3 or 4 years old. So these are not things that develop as a specific program or agenda set out for the purposes of development in the family at large. They were the things the family fed on as they arose incidentally.
Okay. See, I just have to say, right, as I look at the Allen family, here you are, you're studying with Harry Jaffa at Claremont, who is one of the foremost political theorists of his day, and had a strong emphasis on the Declaration of Independence as the core foundation for the constitutional principle. The Constitution was an embodiment of the principles in the Declaration. And here we have in the next generation, the foremost expositor of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, it feels purposeful.
Let me interrupt you to say, I know this looks like lineal descent, but it isn't.
It definitely isn't.
It isn't.
No.
Even though Danielle heard those conversations with graduate students, there was never any presentation of the work that we were doing within the family.
In fact, it's odd, somewhat, these are sort of funny things, how these things work. I mean, I do know exactly what I learned from Harry Jaffa, and that was how to swim.
Oh, really?
It was, yes. He had a swimming pool in his backyard, and his son actually gave me swimming lessons. That was my clearest sense of instruction from Harry Jaffa. And it's funny because I came to work on the Declaration of Independence as a matter of happenstance. I was teaching a night program for low-income adults in Chicago. Our goal was to make sure they got the same quality of education as kids in the day program I taught at the University of Chicago. And that meant a puzzle because lots of these night students didn't have a high school degree. They were working 2 jobs. My day students, they came with the best pedigrees ever, so how were we going to provide the same quality of education? And the solution to the puzzle was to compromise not at all on the quality of what we were teaching, the quality of the text, but to go ahead and use short texts. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but the Declaration of Independence is only 1,337 words. I'm like, it's a short text. That's what I'm going to use. So I started teaching it over and over again in history, in philosophy courses, in writing courses. And it just came alive, and my students came alive with the text. That's why I started working on the Declaration of Independence. And so it's been a very funny experience, actually, writing my book on the Declaration, coming to read it. I did, I heard sort of lurking bits about Harry Jaffe, the Declaration, and only recently has all that come into focus, so I can now see that there is a certain kind of synergy, but there was a strange sort of accident and happenstance to it.
Now, say more, if you would, about the students that you were teaching in the evening program. Profile, demographics, tell us about that.
Sure. So this was in the city of Chicago, and we started out with 1 program but ended up with 3 around the city. So by the time we had 3, they sort of captured the full demography of the city. So South Side course was mostly African American students, West Side more Hispanic students, North Side sort of more of a mixed group, all folks who were sort of barely a certain percentage above the poverty line, basically. Okay. Some of them were working people, but just barely scraping by. Some of them were on disability. Others were just between jobs and trying to find their way back into a sort of course of self-development, of growth. That's what distinguished them. Every single one of them was there because they had looked around at their circumstances and decided they wanted something different. And they had their own personal clarity, again, purpose and sort of response to need, that what they needed was education, and that they needed a mind-growing education, and not just a sort of, more skills. Skills, yes, they needed that, but they also wanted to be full people. They wanted to be civic people and civic participants. And that was what led them to our program. And so that, I think, is also why the magic of the Declaration of Independence was so powerful, because that, too, is a small story about a group of people who look around and consider their circumstances not fit for what they deserve in their core human dignity, and then seek to do something about it.
So you teach the Declaration to a group of marginalized students. There's some that would say that what came out of the Declaration and what follows created a system of systemic exploitation and racism. But you see it as a liberating document.
This country has always been double-voiced. You want to jump in?
No, I wanted to jump in before Paul asked the question, because I think it's important to make the observation that taking up the Declaration in the manner that Danielle just described is similar to the way we take up many things, many texts. We have reasons of expedience and practicality when we are setting a curriculum and determining what to read. The important question is not what the particular text is, but what is the thought that goes into working with the text, and what does one get out of the text. And so this perfectly well illustrates the synergies that Danielle was describing. For we both found, after spending a great deal of time poring over the Declaration of Independence, an inner core, entirely independently of one another, of moral equality as the discriminating concept that makes sense and integrates the entire document. Now, discovering that had to take place against the backdrop of an orthodox interpretation about exclusion, to which you are now referring.
Yeah.
So that knowing that orthodox backdrop as we did, and still being able to find that inner concept that integrates, meant that the document, the text, responded to thought. And the important dimension here is the thinking dimension.
So how do each of you, and maybe you do this in a slightly different way, how do you think then about the fact that many of the men involved in the creation of the Declaration were slave owners?
So I'm going to jump in first.
Go
on
ahead.
this one.
Okay, you go first.
You can have the next one.
I'll go be more long-winded, so you go first.
You know, there's so much to say on this subject. I like to remind people that Thomas Jefferson taught us many things. And one thing he taught us is how to make sure you get credit for something. Because why do we think of him as the author of the Declaration? It's because his tombstone says, author, Declaration of Independence. So let that be your lesson. You want credit for something, put it on your tombstone. It was a joint effort. And I know you know this, Paul. So I'm preaching to the choir. It was joint, it was collaboration. It was North and South, in fact, coming together on the committee that was writing the Declaration. And John Adams, man of Massachusetts, was as much an author of the Declaration of Independence as Thomas Jefferson. And John Adams never held slaves, never thought that enslavement was acceptable. The language of the Declaration was used by Adams in the Massachusetts Constitution, which was used in Massachusetts before the end of the Revolutionary War to abolish enslavement in Massachusetts. So the Declaration comes as much out of an abolition tradition as it comes out of a Jeffersonian tradition. And that's what I meant when I said briefly that this country has always had two voices, at least two. It's always had a multitude of contesting voices fighting, but that voice of liberty and equality has been there from the beginning.
That's a perfect lead-in to what I wanted to say, because I wanted to point out that when Paul phrases the question in the form of asking were there not many signers of the Declaration who were slave owners, that's equivalent to saying because the Declaration was short and there were many signers who were short, that it was short because they were short. I mean, it doesn't convey anything serious. What is important is to understand that people who were working in this collaborative environment were indeed navigating multiple differences, diverse interests and pathways, and the most significant of which is that Danielle just last described, which I like to relate in the form of the story of Stephen Hopkins. Nobody knows who Stephen Hopkins was, despite the fact that the governor of Rhode Island was Stephen Hopkins, and he was one of the signers of the Declaration. But before that third generation Stephen Hopkins was signing the Declaration of Independence, there was a Stephen Hopkins at Jamestown, the first significant settlement, which was only a settlement of adventurers, aristocratic adventurers who were exploiting native labor. That first Stephen Hopkins was sentenced to death for speaking out of turn, popping off at the mouth. Now, we don't know the content of what he said, but we know the context. The context was they were trying to push the Indians to do things the Indians weren't necessarily inclined to do. Mm-hmm. And it is quite likely that Hopkins was protesting their treatment. Since he was the only one there working, he wasn't one of the aristocrats, he was a clerk who was of service to them, and obviously being used to try to accomplish their ends. He was spared death only because he was the only one working. And so he was still alive when his wife died in London, and he got word and returned home to take care of his orphan children. That same Stephen Hopkins returned in 1619 on the Mayflower and was therefore part of that settlement. Got in trouble again. In that colony, he was, of course, still a clerk, but he also opened a public house. And he got in trouble for accepting any and all comers without regard to class or station. Now, he didn't get sentenced to death, but he did get reprimanded. And so by the time you get to the third generation Stephen Hopkins, you've got this fellow who has 2 or 3 slaves of himself, but who in the ferment of the revolution manumits his slaves, then goes to the Declaration of Independence and signs the Declaration. So it is an environment abolitionist as well as affirming on the part of some slaveholding, but slaveholding was not the engine driving that process. From the beginning, it was mixed. It was not set in any linear fashion.
Danielle, anything to add to this?
Well, just it speaks to the importance of choice. So I think often we wrestle with the question of history and, you know, should we or should we not be judging people in the past? And certainly it's not ours to judge. That's for a higher power to do. But nonetheless, it's clear that there have always been moral choices in front of people. And even in the 18th century, it was possible to choose abolition, not enslavement. Precisely. And that we need to say clearly as much as anything else.
And I would say even more clearly, because the affirmation of the good and the right is more important to repeat than the evidence of the evil.
So in looking at the ideas animating the Declaration, how do they speak to us today, to our democratic situation. So, Danielle, I'll just note, people may not be aware that you have recently been a co-chair of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship. And a number of people from the Academy were involved with this. My understanding is an attempt to try to get people across the political spectrum. You've also been out as a part of this on kind of a listening tour. And I guess you've been doing a listening tour as well in Massachusetts as you were running for governor, as it were. So what can you tell us about Americans' confidence right now in our system and how the Declaration might speak to that?
Well, thank you for the big and hard question,
Yeah,
another
well.
one. And it's, your question comes from a place I think we all recognize of how much anxiety and pain we all feel right now as we watch our politics. I think one of the most important things, though, that is a challenge for us is a generational divide. And so I want to actually just say something in that spirit for a moment, and particularly to the students in the room. It's just very painful to me, honestly, that for those of you on college campuses now, the only world you've known is one in which we are fighting so bitterly with each other. And I know that when people from my generation say things like, wow, we did actually used to know how to compromise and stuff, it rings false. How could such a thing have existed? It sounds nostalgic. It's important for us to set our faces to the future and figure out how we secure a healthy democracy for the 21st century on 21st century terms. But I want to just give you a little piece of the Declaration because I think it can animate that work and that thinking. And everybody who knows me will know where I'm going, but I have to give you the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence and invite you to carry it around with you and just spend time thinking about it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, I won't ask you how many of us remembered that the sentence was that long. It is that long. It doesn't stop after pursuit of happiness. It's a whole sentence that leads to our responsibilities for what we do together for our safety and happiness. And it puts the responsibility on our shoulders to diagnose whether we are building together instruments of shared decision-making that can deliver in that way. For us, it's an invitation to thought, that sentence. And I believe that invitation is how the Declaration can animate the work we need to do for our democracy now. But I am really sort of speaking to the students in the room because I want you to have that sentence as your gift and your treasure. Put it in your heart and just spend some time reflecting on it.
And since you've spoken to them, may I speak to their elders? For that beautiful incantation of the Declaration reminded me of the title for this event this evening, which was called, Can the American Experiment Survive? And I want to reassure the elders, who may be the ones most anxious about the survival of the experiment, that they needn't spend much time reflecting on that. For it is not an experiment, it is a fact. There has been quite enough time and quite enough accomplished since the Declaration of Independence to have established the reality of the United States and the principles upon which it's founded. They may have considered it an experiment at the time, We do not have that luxury. We have, in fact, a burden of knowing that if it does fail, it won't fail because the experiment failed, but because we failed. And so when the young are invited to place in their hearts this inspiring incantation, we, the elders, have to remind ourselves that they can be trusted with it, just as we were trusted with it heretofore, and just as the Americans before that were trusted with it. To say that it is a fact and an accomplished fact is not to say there haven't been moments of pain, suffering, and error. There have been many, but there have also been moments of overcoming. And you cannot separate the overcomings and the errors with respect to their relationship to the founding principles. If there's one thing that drives, if there's one dynamic, the dynamic is what set in motion this way of life to begin with. And that is an accomplished fact, so that we should all accustom ourselves to understanding what has been accomplished as a way to fostering our willingness to carry on.
Yes, you talked that way at home.
So it was didactic.
In that regard, I have to say
Okay,
it was.
there we go. Well, the last time, Bill, that you were here, you talked about personal and national character. And you gave us a quote that said, "The arc of justice runs unbendingly through personal and national character." Mm-hmm. Now, Danielle is working on a book that will be out next year called Justice by Means of Democracy. And really looking forward to the publication of this, which focuses on the social conditions that deliver the autonomy necessary for human flourishing and justice. So, Bill, I'm kind of interested. It seems like there may be a little bit of tension here across the generations, where you have a strong focus on the agentive aspect of personal character, and Danielle, it looks like you're focusing a lot on social conditions that can provide justice. Does this ever become a point of contention in your discussions, or do you ever discuss it?
You know, at the conclusion of the Battle of Yorktown, the British fife played "The World Turned Upside Down." And when I was last here in this venue, the podium was on the opposite side of the room. So if your question is asking me whether the world is turned upside down tonight from what I had to say before, no, I don't think so. I think that there is a misperception that Danielle's focus on collective action somehow is a departure from the focus on the responsibility of the agent. And indeed, in that forthcoming book, I think that responsibility, and Danielle can speak for herself about this, but I think that responsibility of the agent is still present. If there's a difference between us, the difference would amount to this, and I would invite her to reflect on this, that she places greater confidence in what she calls the steering of democracy. And that's the task of representatives who, of course, are brought forward through a filtering process in one fashion or the other, leaving aside the institutional details. I, in emphasizing personal character, believe that it is not collective action which is the defining moment in our social existence, but it is rather the coordination of separate choices, decisions, i.e. pursuit of purposes, that are necessarily individually formed. I don't deny that there are influences and including opportunities for persuasion with regard to those individual choices. But I suggest that the moral energy inheres in the individual choices, and the prospects of flourishing generally depend on their coordination.
Danielle?
Sure. So this is going to get a bit technical, so I apologize to everybody. But so for starters, I think agency is fundamentally important, and I think across the corpus of my work that's broadly clear.
Yes.
But to the point around collective action, I think there is a question here around purpose. So I agree about the importance of individual purpose, but I think part of the job of individual purpose, or in clarifying one's individual purpose and acting in relationship to that with a set of strengths of character, I think in addition there's a job of connecting individual purpose up to shared or common purpose. And so that is where I do talk about the steering function of democracy. And it's true that the picture I paint there is highly aspirational. I think it's where we get in our best moments. I think that we often fall short of that, and very often what we are doing instead is sort of brokering arrangements that make it possible for people to pursue individual purposes. But I think the aspirational picture is very important and to be put on the table as well. With regard to the question of social conditions, because I want to speak to your question too, I may have written that phrase, social conditions, there that you read out in that form, but I think in the context of the whole argument, the case I'm trying to make is exactly that, actually. If what you're trying to do is support people's pursuit of their purposes and their responsible interaction with a concept of shared purpose, people need what I call foundation for flourishing. You need a stable floor to stand on. And in that regard, it's a different way of thinking about the sort of material elements of human well-being. It does matter that people have a roof over their heads. That's a stable thing that's necessary. Now, how you get that doesn't answer the question of to what degree do you use market forces, to what degree do you use public sector tools and the like. I think you generally need a blend of such tools. But the point is that, in order for people to succeed at their purposes, they do need to stand on a stable floor. And a lot goes into the work that I believe we ought to do as a community in terms of ensuring that we are building that stable floor for people to stand on. That was very abstract. I apologize.
But let's get concrete then. The work that you've been doing on the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship came out with several near consensus proposals. Do you want to give us a flavor for the kinds of proposals that this particular group came together with? And do they represent in some way, is it reflective of what is your thoughts about these conditions of stability, for example?
Sure. No, so this is a commission about the future of democracy and a set of democracy reforms. Maybe let me put two things together. So when I'm talking about that stable foundation, I'm talking about what in the 19th century was called internal improvements. Lincoln, in his early days, his Whig days, liked to talk about internal improvements. And that was about the railroad, and it was about being able to navigate the rivers and making sure people could get their goods to market and the like, making sure that property was being opened up in ways that people could homestead and build homes for themselves and so forth. It's really that concept of internal improvements that I'm talking about when I'm talking about social conditions. Now, with regard to democracy reforms, that comes to this issue of the collective coordinated action. Can we make sure that we have in our hands the tools for making decisions together that support our shared safety and happiness, that language of the Declaration of Independence? So this commission did a lot of work. We talked to a lot of people. One of the core messages of the report is that some of it's about reforming political institutions, but some of it's about culture and civil society and having a kind of virtuous circle of mutual reinforcement there. But on the political institutions front, for example, one of the things we advocate for is ranked choice voting. And I'm sure you have familiarity with that here in Utah, but on the idea that requires candidates to campaign to secure a full majority. It requires people to build coalitions. It orients people more towards a problem-solving mode of campaigning, reduces the negativity in campaigning, and thereby gives us better tools of cooperation for that shared decision-making.
By the way, the Republican Party in Utah used ranked choice voting in their convention during COVID, and it was before COVID. Yeah.
Great. Good.
Well, keep going on, because I think there's some interesting, talk a bit about, you said that there's institutional kinds of things. You've mentioned ranked choice voting. What are civil society reforms or actions that are going to be important?
Well, so in the civil society space, we really focused on two things. One is the problem of the division in our culture and the need to really build people up in their skills at bridging those divides. So there are some recommendations that are about supporting nonprofit organizations that are cultivating bridging skills and building contexts where people come together across all kinds of lines of division, whether partisan or demographic or religious and secular and things like that. So that was sort of one chunk of recommendations in that space. The second challenge we really focused on was the problems with our information ecosystem, challenges of disinformation and misinformation, the lack of access to sort of curated information that people feel like they can get their heads around in terms of knowing what to use and what not. And we had some recommendations around social media platforms and the like that had the goal of trying to help get us back to a healthier information ecosystem.
Okay. And what about culture?
On the culture side, so let me back up a little bit, actually, and maybe just sort of share where the notion of the sort of three parts came from. Really, as Paul mentioned, as we did this work on the commission, we had listening sessions all over the country, and we talked to all kinds of folks. We talked to people who never vote at all, for example. Like we went out of our way to find people who never vote, had focus groups just of non-voters, and then people who take the highest, sort of sense of duty with them, naval cadets, for instance. We talked to recent refugees and longer-term immigrant communities. We talked to suburban folks and urban folks and across the partisan divide. And there was one gentleman in Maine who said something which was sort of the light bulb moment for the commission. He said, look, like right now, our institutions, they just don't work. This dysfunction is huge, and then who wants to participate in that? But then, if you don't participate, we don't participate in the organizations that connect us to politics, that connect us to each other, and then our understanding of each other degrades. So it's kind of like it's a vicious circle, isn't it? We're stuck in this vicious circle, but isn't democracy supposed to be a virtuous circle? And that was sort of our aha moment. The idea that you have to have responsive institutions that are trustworthy because that pulls people into participation. But that process of participation is also necessary to keep those institutions healthy and functional. The chance to participate is also a way of ensuring that we can sustain and nourish a culture of shared commitment to one another and to our constitutional democracy. So that was the job in the cultural space. How do we nourish a shared sense of mutual commitment and shared commitment to constitutional democracy? Now that's a mouthful, that list of words I just gave you about that shared commitment. And why did we end up there? This actually points to the heart of our challenge. We ended up there because when we did work, again, through all these focus groups, trying to say, well, what are some shared values Americans have? 9 out of 10 were easy, actually, despite partisan differences. Freedom, equality, fairness, opportunity, equality before the law, constitutionalism, easy. Both sides. Everybody came up with those words, okay? But where did we get stuck? Patriotism, solidarity. Two different worlds, two different names for the bond we should have to each other and to our country. So that's why we ended up saying, we've got to do work on our shared commitment to one another and to our constitutional democracy, because we couldn't say patriotism and we couldn't say solidarity, because that would just cause a fight. But so that then seemed to us the most important question, was to sort of go around and start asking people, why do you love your country? Because everybody does actually, and you can also be angry at things you love, you may have noticed. So it's possible for love and anger to coexist, but everybody actually does love the country and has many different reasons for doing so. We found that that project of asking people to tell the story of why they love the country was very productive for getting us to a place where we could talk again about how to think about this commitment we should have to one another and to our constitutional democracy. Sorry, that was very long-winded.
Well, no, but it's perfect in setting up my last question. And then we'll open this up to the audience for a few questions. Why do you love our country, Bill?
I love the way Paul likes to pose these questions that are so very challenging, to which he already knows the answer. because he knows that my highest obligation is not to my country, that is to my God. But what he wants me to do is to distinguish that first obligation above the obligation to civil society, which is the obligation to God, from therefore what is the functional and effective commitment to the country. And that's easy enough to explain, Paul. The country is the place where I have been placed to do the work I have been put in this world to do. Not to love the country is to hate what God has assigned me to do. I do not hate what God has assigned for me to do. I want to counsel all of us to take patriotism seriously, to take love of country seriously, but not to turn it into a divine principle. And we often have a tendency to try to do that, and it's a big mistake. Now, I've written recently over the effort that was exerted by Lincoln especially, and others besides, to reintroduce some notion of the sacred into our common life. Because what the modern world has done is strip it all out and try to put in the place of the sacred totally secularly derived principles of solidarity or commitment. That is an enterprise which will fail. It will not work. If there is not some element of sacralization, we're spinning our wheels and wasting our time. And we can say, yes, the so-called experiment proved itself, but no, like all things on this earth, it is not going to last forever. And therefore, to speak of it in such reverential terms as you invite me to do, is to ask me to mislead you. And I would never do that. I have an ethical responsibility not to mislead you.
Danielle.
So for me, it is a simple answer, and it is about God's purposes, but in a different kind of way. In my case, the focus is on what God has made possible for each and every one of us, our human potentials and possibilities. I believe that freedom and equality are what we humans can build with, principles we can build with, to make a world that gives us the chance of bringing out the best in all of us. And so that fact that I'm a part of that is why I love the country.
I'm guessing you have a question or two you'd like to pose. We have a microphone over here. We are going to ask you to, if you have a question, to stand up, go over to the microphone. I think Grant has a question. He's about ready to stand up and get over and ask a question. But please, we have a few minutes left with some of the best minds in the country on the moral foundations of our constitutional democracy. Have at it.
All right, well, I actually was hoping that you could maybe both elaborate on something you kind of passed over briefly, which is our trials are our triumphs.
Trials are our what?
I'm badly paraphrasing you, but I think you said our trials and our triumphs are inextricably combined, right?
Oh, yes.
So if American history isn't one happy story, it's not also one tragic story. And anyway, so I actually just was hoping you could elaborate more on that, and especially how do you communicate that idea to undergrads? Because I'm faculty here, and that's something I struggle to. How do you communicate both parts of that story, the failures but the successes, and do so fairly, with justice to both our failures and our triumphs?
You go ahead.
So, I think, I appreciate your question, and a lot of people are wrestling with that right now. It's what I was recently part of a big team of people across the country who published something called the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap. And we named as a sort of design challenge trying to answer exactly that question. I think from my own personal experience, my answer has been to let history speak for itself, to find primary sources, because there is no primary source from our history that isn't already sort of caught in some contest or struggle of some kind, and to understand how any voice is speaking to us, whether it's a John Adams or a Thomas Jefferson or Prince Hall, Free African American in Boston from the same time period, or Frederick Douglass, or Harriet Tubman, Harriet Jacobs, Abraham Lincoln. I mean, put those voices on the table and let them speak, and I think then students can bring their own thought to that and come up with a way of connecting to it.
Amen. I say we are in complete agreement with that, and it is something, I think I made this comment the last time I was here, that there's nothing like the primary text to introduce people to the full story. So that I encourage people, yes, you can read secondary interpretations and histories if you have time, but if you don't have time, read the primary text.
And I've got a long list of short ones.
Well, so you probably don't know this. You're preaching to the choir. I'm a faculty here in history, in American history, so students listen up and come take my class.
And as you step forward, introduce yourselves, if you would.
My name is Joseph Addington. I am a political science student here at BYU. And I was just wondering, we've talked about some of the issues in American life. Certainly, the country seems to be divided. There is a question about, this very conference is about the survival of the American experiment or the American fact, one way or the other. What would you say the most important thing that we here at BYU, either as students or faculty or staff, can do in order to revive a greater sense of patriotism or solidarity, and basically what can we do in order to benefit the country based on the principles that you've been elaborating?
Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Be the best that you can be.
Well,
I would say that certainly, as long as you understand your question to mean, what can I do with myself? Then, of course, I think the answer is fairly intuitive. I'm thinking of that project that Danielle mentioned a moment ago, this Educating for American Democracy, or for Advancing Democracy, as the case may be, for American democracy. They described that project as trying to get people to figure out what questions to ask, the right questions, shaping the right questions. So that's bringing a certain kind of intelligence to the task. And what I add to what they have said is it's as important to find out where to seek the answers to the right questions. So where to find the right answers. So if you dedicate yourself to finding the right answers, you will be dedicating yourself to giving the best that you have to give.
Now, what I was going to say was just to celebrate you for asking already a really good and important question. So in that regard, you have already found your answer. Prefer to asking the question, so you see I'm kind of saying the same thing as him. But then what I was going to add was, and this is, I guess, where we're going a slightly different direction, is find a group of people to ask that question together with, think together with others about it, and ask yourselves, well, what do you think would make a difference for that experience of human connection, of people across lines of difference with each other here at BYU? And if you just ask that very specific human question, I think you'll have the seeds for really positive work.
Say more about across lines.
That's what I wanted to speak to. Let me say this and then have her follow that, because that's what I wanted to speak to. One of the strong lines in the work that Danielle is doing is the argument about bridging and linking, and this sort of forming connections across sectors, across groups, etc. And what I would like to do is to emphasize how important it is to see that forming connections with others is really working upon oneself. And just as I think I said at lunch this afternoon, if justice is the preference for another's good, it doesn't mean at the expense of one's own good. In fact, that is one's good, to put oneself in that state of soul to be able to prefer the good of others. And building those linkages is part of that process.
Yeah, that's right. Do you want me to make that?
Yeah, please, yeah.
I'll make that very specific in a very boring way, but let me just share the example of the Educating for American Democracy roadmap in a little bit more detail. So this is a roadmap that was released in March of 2021, laying out a framework for excellence in history and civic learning for all learners K through 12. It was a project that had 300 educators and scholars working on it across the country, cross-ideological group, demographically diverse, et cetera. We have the rare distinction of perhaps being the only project that was funded by both the Trump and the Biden administrations. So we consider this a very significant accomplishment. And the most important part about it was really that it was a cross-ideological group, and we were wrestling with the question of how to have a shared picture of what counts as excellence for history and civics learning for all learners. And how do we get there? There's no magic wand you wave. It's about the relationships and the work. So first we started with a group of 6, and we made sure our group was a bridging group, a cross-ideological group. And we were working for about 2 weeks, and we got into a big fight. Over whether we were needing to educate young people for life in a republic or for life in a democracy.
I wanted to get to that.
And we spent weeks fighting over this question. And we came to see that those who were arguing for a republic were really focused on issues of constitutionalism and order and structure, among other things, and those who were really focused on the concept of democracy were really focused on popular participation, popular sovereignty, inclusion of all in this process. It's like, all right, fine, there's something here on both sides. We're gonna have to compromise. So we decided we were educating young people for a constitutional democracy. That was our compromise phrase, okay? Between republic and democracy is constitutional democracy. Good. So you'll see it's all the way through the roadmap. And the point is just that as we worked, we hit fights. We worked hard on those fights. We took them seriously. We didn't walk around them, but we also did it with charity in our hearts for each other. And we kept building our group out from 6 ultimately to 300, always making sure we brought that diversity in. But it was always working on the relationships. It's from the relationships first that we'll have the chance of rebuilding our capacity to do things together.
Yeah, this is something I wanted to be sure we got in before we finish this evening, since our title implied we were going to talk about democracy, and we talked about the American experiment. And there are people who don't like to use that word democracy, we know that, and there's those who prefer the word republic instead, and I understand where they're coming from. But I also think we need to work to get over some of these false understandings, and this is a set of false understandings. The word democracy could mean something like mob rule if you took a distorted view of it, yes. But that's not what was intended when in 1777, Alexander Hamilton invented the expression representative democracy. And in that concept of representative democracy, which he introduced in deliberations about the New York State Constitution, the Constitution that came closest to resembling the Constitution of 1787 for the nation, what he was channeling, in effect, was the idea of preserving that which was sought in democracy in such a manner as to insulate it from the danger to which democracy was subject, particularly the danger of demagoguery, demagogic expression. And that meant achieving the accomplishment of popular will through representative institutions. That was still a democratic project. That's why James Madison could call it wholly popular in the Federalist Papers, so that we don't have to worry about the tension between democracy and republic so long as we understand that the founders didn't have any problem with that once they had embraced the concept of representative democracy as a synonym for republic. They knew exactly what they were doing, and we can embrace it without being at all squeamish.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear. We have one final question.
So I'm Porter Nichols. I am a manufacturing engineer here at BYU. Well, that's my major. Not quite a manufacturing engineer yet, but kind of in engineer fashion. We have talked a lot about ideas and principles, and I kind of have a more practical application for these principles. I have a friend. He grew up in New York. He served in the military for a little bit. And me and him, we actually end up butting heads about this country and its need to continue. He thinks that the country would be better if it was revamped, if the Constitution was rewritten and redone to be more updated. And I believe that the Constitution is a divine document and that it's akin to the Word of God and shouldn't really be really influenced all that much. And so we kind of have this debate going back and forth. And it seems that you say that most people do love the country. It seems that he has lost or doesn't have that same love that I do, or that a lot of us share. And so if you were presented an opportunity to speak with him and me, what would you say?
Well, I'll take you back to the Declaration of Independence again. Now, the Constitution doesn't really invoke a higher power, but the Declaration does. So if you want to listen to where the drafters of those texts were really bringing in reflections on a higher power, I think the Declaration of Independence is the text for you. And the sentence that I shared with you, remember where it ends, whenever any government becomes destructive of these ends, that is, it's no longer serving the purposes of securing our rights, it's the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Mm-hmm. That's the heavy charge the Declaration is laying on us, and it's a charge for us to think for ourselves about our circumstances and conditions, and it's a reminder that it is our right to alter where necessary. But the job of alteration has two parts. It's about being clear about those principles, and it's about thinking about how to organize the powers of government. The Declaration of Independence was the expression of principle, but even it is incomplete. It's an invitation to think further, right? When I said, among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are examples, not a complete list. What else goes on that list? It's an invitation to every generation to think. And then the organizing the powers of government part, that was the Constitution. That's its job, is to figure out how to organize the powers of government. So the Declaration is actually explicitly telling us it's our job to diagnose our circumstances and to consider, given our principles, how should the powers of government be organized? It is actually up to us to judge that question.
And may I add that there is a realistic element in this that we mustn't forget, that we are always permanently subject to good-willed abandonment of the nation, of the Constitution. You say you regard the Constitution as divine writ. Remember, it's placed in human hands and human care. And just like the temple in Jerusalem, it can be torn down by human hands. And that can be done not with evil intent, but with good-willed intent, simply because people misunderstand. And so hearing your friend from that perspective requires that you first try to understand the perspective from which he's speaking. Is it with good-willed intent or with evil intent that he makes this suggestion? If it's good-willed, you have the opportunity to engage him.
Thank you.
Well, this hour has been too short. We've been so blessed to have you with us on our campus for this lovely day. We hope that you'll come back and visit with us again in the not-too-distant future. Let's thank the Allens for an elaborate evening. Lovely evening.